Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die. How do you propose to kill me now, Mr. Bond?
Mr. Bond here will have a small memorial service.
Double jeopardy, Mr. Bond.
Clumsy effort, Mr. Bond. You disappoint me.
Spend the money quickly, Mr. Bond.
Simple choices, Mr. Bond.
Observe, Mr. Bond. The instruments of Armageddon.
Any higher, Mr. Bond, my ears will pop.
I think there are many things about Mr. Bond one does not know.
Mr. Bond will have a vodka martini, shaken, not stirred.
So as charming as you are, Mr. Bond.
Aren't you in the wrong room, Mr. Bond?
What kind of banking do you specialize in, Mr. Bond?
Why do you persist in rescuing me, Mr. Bond?
Thank you for the drink.
Mr. Bond. You presume a great deal, Mr. Bond.
You are very suspicious, Mr. Bond.
You seem like a man who's gagging for some action, Mr. Bond.
Your powers of observation do you credit, Mr. Bond.
You've been reading the wrong books, Mr. Bond.
You don't have to worry about me, Mr. Bond.
I think we ought to let Mr. Bond carry the load from here on out.
It was transferred to the account number your company gave us, Mr. Bond.
And who's afraid now, Mr. Bond?
Very clever, Mr. Bond.
If you just sign here, Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond can make whatever use of it he thinks fit.
Whatever's happening, Mr. Bond, has started.
Well, really, Mr. Bond.
Welcome to Jamaica, Mr. Bond.
Welcome to Japan, Mr. Bond.
You're in the Balkans now, Mr. Bond.
32 for Mr. Bond.
Welcome, Mr. Bond.
Your baggage is already down, Mr. Bond.
Ah, yes, Mr. Bond.
This will be your room, Mr. Bond. Oh, Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond?
Mr. Bond.
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 Good morning, Mr. Bond.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bond.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bond.
Good night, Mr. Bond.
Good night, Mr. Bond.
Good night, Mr. Bond.
Sweet dreams, Mr. Bond.
Is there anything else our French station can do for Monsieur Bond?
Monsieur Bond?
Ah, Senor Bond.
Bonjour, Monsieur Bond.
I see you are a connoisseur, Monsieur Bond.
Senor Bond.
Bitte aus Ramsgate, Herr Bond.
Bonsoir, Monsieur Bond.
Senor Bond, you got big cornies.
Mr. Bond, it's good to see you again.
Good to work with you again, Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond, so good to see you.
Why, my dear Mr. Bond.
I'm beginning to like you, Mr. Bond.
Thank you, Mr. Bond.
You are a funny man, Mr. Bond.
Can I do something for you, Mr. Bond?
Glad to know you, Mr. Bond.
Oh, nice to have met you, Mr. Bond.
To us, Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond of the British Secret Service.
Ahoy, Mr. Bond. Ahoy, Mr. Bond.
Take Mr. Bond to school.
Sorry, Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond, you have an urgent phone call.
Do you like Japanese sake, Mr. Bond?
You're a kite dancing in a hurricane, Mr. Bond.
You know your history, Mr. Bond.
It's a soundproof room, Mr. Bond. Nobody hears you scream.
This is where we leave you, Mr. Bond. Therein lies your problem, Mr. Bond.
I'm afraid you'll never have that pleasure, Mr. Bond.
Keep your hands up, Mr. Bond.
I'll see you later, Mr. Bond.
Behave yourself, Mr. Bond.
I owe you an unpleasant death, Mr. Bond.
Don't move, Mr. Bond.
I think your odds are improving, Mr. Bond.
I love my country, Mr. Bond.
Farewell, Mr. Bond.
Do not kill me, Mr. Bond.
We're pros, Mr. Bond.
It seems you have competition, Mr. Bond.
No, Mr. Bond.
Superb, Mr. Bond. Superb.
Mr. Bond, sir?
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond.
Mr. Bond!
Seems you beat me, Mr. Bond.
You amuse me, Mr. Bond.
You only live twice, Mr. Bond.
You seem to be unbeatable, Mr. Bond.
Oh, Mr. Bond.
No hard feelings, Mr. Bond.
Desolated, Mr. Bond.
Heartbroken, Mr. Drax.